The country of Burkina Faso, Africa, has just kicked out a French embassy member in their country. Now, the reason why this is such a big deal is because now we have reason to believe that Burkina Faso is working with the Russians. Now, the reason why this is an issue is because this directly affects the U.S. military. Because look, anyone who starts working with the Russians in Africa, your country starts to fall apart. There's more violence in the region. You have more upticks of militant groups, and these groups naturally bleed into Niger, where U.S. forces are training, and where ECOWAS also starts to fall apart, all of these other African nations. Now, in this video, we're going to go over what's happening in Burkina Faso and how there is a direct correlation to when you kick out the French, when you start working with military powers like the Russians, your country starts to fall apart. Now, right here it reads, Burkina Faso junta orders the French embassy's defense attaché to leave. Now, I was like, what even is this position? Is this that big of a deal? Well, it is a big deal because when I was looking into what this position is, in conventional order, the defense attaché is ranked third in the embassy after the ambassador and minister counselor. So this is a high-ranking official who is a delegate from France into whatever country. So Burkina Faso kicking them out, it makes total sense because Niger is kicking out the ambassador. Currently, at the time of making this video, has him held hostage. Mali kicked out the French, and Burkina Faso wants to follow suit. The only issue with Burkina Faso is they don't have another major military superpower to sort of back them. That is what a lot of these coups do. They take over the countries, but then they try to align themselves with a major superpower to back them economically and with security. And we'll get into that in a second with how they're probably most likely working with the Russians. Now, as far as this news story right here, Burkina Faso's military junta has ordered the French embassy's defense attaché to leave the country due to subversive behavior, it said in a leaked letter seen by Reuters on Friday. Now, of course, whenever these juntas, even in Niger, kick out whoever, it's always very vague terms. You almost have zero evidence. But these countries don't really need any evidence. They are the sovereign leaders of these countries, so they can kick them out if they want. The attaché Emmanuel Pasquier's expulsion is the latest sign of increasing tension between West African nation and its former colonizer France since a military government seized power in 2 coups last year. France has maintained strong ties with its former colonies and has troops stationed across West Africa. But hostility towards its presence has soared since a string of military coups. And again, if you think it just so happens that all of these coups are kicking out the French and they're also working with the Russians just as a coincidence, that you're wrong. I'm sorry, you're just wrong about that. Now, Burkina Faso recently, of course, also just spoke to Russia in a possible military cooperation. Let's go ahead and watch this clip. At the time of making this video, this is only a couple of weeks old.
Burkina Faso's interim president held talks with a Russian delegation on Thursday, including discussions on military cooperation. The visit, amid Western concerns over the Kremlin's expanding influence in the region, saw Ibrahim Traoré sit down with Russia's Deputy Defense Minister Yunusbek Yevkurov.
Military cooperation, technical military cooperation, but also cooperation in the field of the economy, in the field of nuclear energy, are all questions.
Now understand this, for a country like Burkina Faso, who doesn't have a great economy, has terrible security, we'll get into that, this is a strategy that if I was a junta, if you were a junta, why not? Who else are you going to reach out to in ECOWAS when the French are telling you what to do, or you have a lot of outside influences telling your country how to operate? Now, again, I am not in support of a junta. I'm not in support of violence, but when you try to look at things from the perspective of these juntas, it makes total sense as to why they would be operating in this fashion in working with the Russians.
We will do our best to help you develop in all these spheres. I have already reminded your president of this. In the field of military cooperation, we will discuss the training format of your cadets and officers of different levels, including pilots in our country.
One thing about Russia, when you look into their military, and this is a fatal flaw of Russia, notice he said officers and cadets. They put a lot of emphasis on the officers and cadets. And a lot of people who look into the military structure of Russia, I actually even have friends who worked in the U.S. military where at the time they've trained with the Russians. Believe it or not, the U.S. military and the Russians have trained together. The flaw is they focus too much on their officers and not enough on their non-commissioned officers, where in the U.S. military, there's sort of an equal playing ground of non-commissioned officers train the troops, the officers get the means to train the troops. So again, it's just funny to see the Russian military strategy bleed into these African nations, and these African nations don't even realize this is the worst strategy to only focus on your officers if you don't have a good non-commissioned officer or enlisted role.
Junta-led Burkina Faso's relations with Moscow have been in the spotlight since it booted out French troops in February. That fueled speculation that it would deepen security ties with Russia like in neighbouring Mali, where Russian Wagner mercenaries operate. The visit could also be a further sign that Russia is seeking to shore up its influence in Africa.
Now, this graph right here makes Burkina Faso look like a pepperoni pizza. And I'm not trying to make a joke of this, but Burkina Faso is in a massive, massive issue for its citizens and for the country. These little red dots are epicenters of attacks that are happening. Now, you'll notice that outside of the center of Burkina Faso, where you do have a lot of security, a lot of these attacks don't happen. That's because these militant groups, and you always see this direct correlation when you look at charts and you look at the epicenters of where attacks happen, they're all staged throughout these border regions where there's not a lot of security going on. In Niger, in Mali, Costa Ivory, in Togo, Benin. And the bad part, again, for the U.S. military and troops operating in Niger, all of these militant groups, they do what's called border hopping or border crossing, where they'll do an attack in Burkina Faso, but then they'll cross on over into Niger and do whatever they want in Niger, because you do have jurisdiction. If you're troops in Burkina Faso, you can't just chase after militants in Niger and vice versa. And so again, unfortunately for Burkina Faso, they're almost put in a position to where they need to back with somebody. They need to work with the Russians because they don't have another choice. They're not going to work with the United States, who works with ECOWAS. They're not going to work with the French. They already kicked them out. And ever since they kicked out the French, they've had a massive uptick in uprisings with these militant groups. But if I had to speculate, I guarantee that Russia would only work in your country if the French are kicked out, because we have reason to believe that's what's happening in Mali. And looking in this chart with Mali, again, 2023, this all correlates together because Mali and Burkina Faso really have become strong allies, considering they've both fallen to juntas. They both have coups. Mali has strong ties with Russia. But the other issue is this, is that Mali's militant groups also pass into Burkina Faso and pass into Niger, or straight from Mali into Niger. But nonetheless, again, you have these border regions where you have all of these attacks happening from Burkina Faso into Mali and vice versa. So it makes sense for the Russians now to be like, see, we'll come work with you guys. We'll help defend your country. We'll help build your country. We'll give you guys jets and blah, blah, blah. But we all know when you look at Mali, ever since they started working with the Russians and kicking the French out and kicking the UN out, the attacks have actually increased. So I find it really interesting that Burkina Faso could care less and is still like, you know what, let's work with the Russians. Who cares? Burkina Faso's interim president, Ibrahim, on Thursday said Russia has become a key strategic ally, but they denied that Russian mercenaries are supporting Burkinabe forces in their fight against armed groups, militant groups. Relations with Moscow are in the spotlight as anti-French sentiment rises in parts of the region. Now, again, I don't think it's just a coincidence that Mali, Burkina Faso both despise the French. They've had coups, and now all of a sudden they're working with Russia. This is a key move that Russia does. They've done it with Sudan. They've done it with other African countries to come into these broken countries and work with them. It's a lot easier to work with countries from the ground up than to try cooperating with the French when the French and other European countries, they're technically fighting one another in Ukraine. So again, it doesn't make sense. Now, as far as Niger goes, Russia can't get into Niger because the United States has made a peace deal and has cooperation with Niger to not work with the Russians. I firmly believe that Niger is smart enough to realize that the United States is there with good intentions, and if you look at the data and correlation between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Russia, it only gets worse and worse for these countries.
Burkina Faso's military junta has expelled France's ambassador, authorities said on Monday, amid a surge in anti-French sentiment as the West African country moves to develop closer ties with Russia. Government spokesperson confirmed that Ambassador Luc Alad was asked to leave but provided no further details. Alad's expulsion comes less than 2 weeks after United Nations resident and humanitarian coordinator in Burkina Faso, Barbara Manzi, was declared persona non grata. Anti-French sentiment has been growing in the former French colony since the new junta leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, seized power in September. Last month, Burkina Faso's Prime Minister visited Russia to strengthen relations and consolidate efforts to combat extremists in the region.
So that's currently what's happening in Burkina Faso. You have a French government official being expelled. And when you look at the patterns between all of these countries, how it works is you have a coup uprising, you then have an increase of violence, you then pin yourself in the corner of what are we going to do? We just kicked the French out, we're kicking out the UN, Russia sweeps on in. Now, there is another wild card to all of this where Wagner Group, we don't know exactly what's going on. However, Russia does have other military means to work with these African countries. So, in my opinion, I think Burkina Faso, they have no choice. They have to work with the Russians, unfortunately. I wish they didn't. I wish they worked with partners like the United States and other Western backers who are willing to work with Burkina Faso, but the countries have had enough. There's this underlying, undertone of we can't stand the French. The French are destroying our country. Let's go ahead, form a coup, work with Russia. And unfortunately, again, when you work with Russia, you have an increase of attacks. These attacks bleed into Niger. And the most unspoken about conflict in all of this is how the United States now has to figure out how we're going to defend Niger, because the United States is not in Niger just for fun. They're there to fight the enemy. And the United States can only do so much. If all of these militant groups bleed into Niger, it undermines and undercuts the United States. It makes them look even worse. It makes them look bad. And that's why Niger really even had a coup. They said the French are not even doing their job. They're supposed to be defending this country. They're not defending anything. Kick them out. As far as the United States, it almost seems like they're on their last straw to show how we really are here to defend themselves. We've invested in Niger for about 20 years. We're here to help you. But if Burkina Faso and Mali keep continuing on this this downfall of violence, it's just going to look even worse for the United States, and I have no idea how they're going to operate through all of this. So nonetheless, okay, Burkina Faso, another country kicking out a French government official, and the trend continues. We'll see what happens with Niger because they're doing the exact same thing. They're like following this playbook of juntas and coups throughout Africa.